Alright, so we're starting the third section here in terms of some notes today. You guys are going to have to listen to this and you're going to have to pause from time to time. I want you to actually put the work in while you're doing this so that you can actually get something done and get something out of this. First thing, you're going to need to read page 319. Okay, so pause this and read page 319. Do it now. Okay, so make sure you've read it. Gives you a nice introduction. If you haven't read it yet, do it now. Good, okay. So what we want to be looking at is we're going to kind of start this off talking about plants, and we're talking about them as specific multicellular organisms that have specialized structures. Up until now, we've talked about cells in sort of a very generic sense. I mean, we've distinguished between plant and animal cells. But we haven't really done anything further than that. We've said plant cells have some organelles that are different than animal cells, but we haven't really got into any kind of this idea of specialized structures. And that's something that you can't get if something is unicellular. And so let's get to this next thing and we'll just look here. So we can talk about the difference between unicellular and multicellular organisms. Unicellular usually exists as a single cell. Now that said, they could be bonded to other cells in a colony, but they each still function as individual units. Because they are bonded together, they do get certain amounts of protection from the outside, but each of the individual cells does all of its life functions for itself. Okay. When we get to multicellular organisms, that does not always hold true. So unicellular organisms can be bonded to other cells in a colony, but each of them function as individual units. They have a very high surface area to volume ratio, which means there's rapid diffusion and osmosis, which means the oxygen, the nutrients, the water, whatever is needed by the cell gets to it very quickly. Waste gets out very quickly. Okay? Examples of these could be things like euglena, paramecium, amoeba. All of these are different types of single-celled organism. Bacteria fit this bill as well. Certain types of parasites, not all parasites, but certain types as well. Okay? Now that would be unicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms. These are composed of many cells that must work together in order to keep the entire organism alive. Usually these are structurally complex. They have specialized tissues, specialized organs, and specialized organ systems. So an example, and I'd like you to write this down. You've got room on the piece of paper. Example of some of these specialized tissues could be, we're talking about, actually this will cooperate with me. We could be talking about heart, muscle tissue, or heart valve tissue. I could continue this. We could talk about heart nervous tissue. We could talk about different types of epithelial tissue in the heart. All of these different tissues, which are vital for the functioning of a specific organ. In this case, we're talking about the heart. Would be an example of a specific organ. And the heart is part of a certain organ system, which is known as the circulatory system. Okay. Now, if I was to take a cell from somebody's heart, it can't survive by itself. I mean, we could put it in a specialized environment of the lab and keep it alive, but it would not be a living organism that can just go wandering off by itself into the big wide world and keep surviving. It's not a unicellular organism. Unicellular organisms can generally live in fairly diverse environments. Now, obviously, they do have to have nutrients and things like that with them, but they're able to survive by themselves. If I take a heart muscle cell, it takes a very specialized scientific setup for it to survive by itself. And it can't do all of the things that it would need to stay alive. It is very specialized, but it doesn't necessarily have the ability to perform all life functions. We could get even crazier with this, and we could talk about a red blood cell. A human red blood cell actually, as it matures, gets rid of its nucleus so that it's got more room to transport oxygen. And then there's and I'll get you to write this down as well. It is an interesting thing that can happen. It's a process called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, where in order for the entire organism to remain alive, certain cells have to die. And the entire organism won't function properly unless those specific cells die. We're going to actually talk about some of those in plants later today. Okay. Now, if you're going to have a large multicellular organism, there's lots of requirements, but there's a few of them here. First of all, the division of labor. Generally, cells are specialized for one specific task, and they do it very well. They're very efficient at their one task, but they wouldn't necessarily be good at all tasks. So, for example, in humans, not only do you have nerve cells, which are different than, skin cells or heart cells or muscle cells, but you have different types of nerve cells. You have nerve cells that end just about everywhere sorry, let me try that again. In all skin surfaces of the body that can only transmit pain impulses. There's other types of nerve cells, I haven't written them down here, but they would only transmit pressure. Others that only deal with temperature. And we've got other nerve cells that are located in your brain that only perform cognitive functions. Okay? So definitely a division of labor. If the multicellular organism is going to be large, it requires an internal transport system. And this has to do because there's a low surface area to volume ratio. Okay. If you think back to that graph in the last set of notes where you had the pictures of the shrew, or not the shrew, I guess the pictures, but the graph with the shrew, the mice, the rabbit, the human, the horse, and the elephant. Because as organisms get bigger, they have overall a low surface area to volume ratio. There is a low rate of diffusion and osmosis. Now, having an efficient internal transport system allows the organism to grow to a larger size. Because the organism cannot rely, and you couldn't survive if you just kind of lay in moist dirt and were waiting for oxygen to be absorbed through your skin. Okay? Even if your skin was good at conducting oxygen through it, which it's not, it would take far too long for that oxygen to reach all the parts of your body if you're just relying on diffusion. Instead, you've got a circulatory system where your heart pumps blood through your body, which allows oxygen and nutrients to get to all the different places where it's needed. Okay. And the third thing that we need to have is we need to have the interdependence of the cells. Now, this means that the death of one cell may not kill the organism, like I was saying before, where sometimes, in fact, you have to have a cell die for the rest of the organism to properly survive. We can compare this with a unicellular organism where the death of the cell means that the organism itself is dead. Right? If you've got a paramecium and something eats it or it dies, that's it. Okay? So, keeping this kind of in the back of our minds, let's move on and talk a little bit about plants. And we'll start with some definitions that we've already sort of talked about, and you would have talked about these back in grade 8 science, but that's been a while, so we'll just review them here real quick. If we have a group of cells, and this is true for not just plants, not just animals, but any multicellular organism, groups of cells that work together to do a common job are called tissues. And then if you group a group of tissues together, you'll get what's called an organ. You group some organs together, you get an organ system. Okay? Now plants have two main organ systems, shoots and the roots. They rhyme, they're easy to remember. And in fact, where they are, the shoots are above the ground. The roots are below the ground. So again, easy to remember. Within the two systems, there's specialized cells that keep the plant alive. So some tissues are specialized for gas exchange, for water movement, for photosynthesis, for strength, and so on. Now, plants themselves get larger in two ways. First of all, we can have the cell size increasing. And second of all, through mitosis, where they're producing more cells. Okay, and this is something that's not written here, so I'm going to get you to write that in beside mitosis. Mitosis would be the production or the growth of new cells. Okay, now mitosis, you'll talk a lot more about it in Bio 30, but is where you have one parent cell and it gives rise to two daughter cells. Now, in plants, mitosis occurs in specific areas. And these growing points of the plant are called meristems. The meristematic regions, and you can write that down here, meristematic regions are located at the tips of the roots, the tips of the shoots. Okay, and so you can have them at the bottoms of the roots or at the ends of branches. That's where plants grow from. Okay, so if you want to take a look at what these look like, you can see here, now this is an allium or an onion root tip, and what you have here is the end of it is sort of a root cap. And then underneath that root cap, which is kind of what's pushing through the soil, you've got this region, and it's sort of a darkish greenish color here, that is the meristem region. You'd have similar meristematic regions in the shoots as well, at the ends of the leaves, ends of the branches, and so on. Okay? So those meristematic regions, those growing points, that's where plants grow, where they get larger. Now, plants have four major types of tissue. There's many more types, but these are the major ones that I care that you know about. The first type is dermal tissue, or the epidermis of the plant. You have an epidermis as well. Yours is different than a plant's, but in that way, it's the surface outer layer of cells, just like on you. Now, pause this for a minute. Read page 321. Take a look at the picture there. It shows some of those different types. And I want you to just specifically read the part about dermal tissue on page 321. So what is dermal tissue? Well, it's the outer layer of cells. It controls gas exchange into and out of the plant. That's one of its functions. Some plants have a waxy layer, on the outside of the epidermis, and it's called the cuticle. Okay, the purpose of this cuticle is it helps to limit water loss. Different types of leaves will have different amounts of cuticle. So you can look at the outside of a leaf and think about that versus like a pine or a spruce needle. The leaf has much less cuticle than the pine or spruce needle does. The outside of the leaf might have a little bit, but it's much more thick on that pine or spruce needle. The pine and spruce needle is there, the cuticle helps it to limit water loss. So that's the first type of tissue, dermal tissue. Second type is called ground tissue. Now, ground tissue is sort of a generic term for the type of tissue that makes up most of the plant. It's what you get when you go below the epidermis. Okay, depending on where in the plant we're talking about, ground tissue has 3 different functions. If it's in the leaves, ground tissue is the location for photosynthesis. Now, I know we've talked about photosynthesis briefly. I'm going to get you to write down, and you need to remember this chemical formula as well as the word equation. So let's start with the word equation. Photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water, and that's going to give us oxygen gas plus glucose. Now you should remember from the chemistry section how you could write this out, but what we're going to have, and I'll give it to you in its balanced form, I won't make you balance this one right now. We have 6 CO2s, and I can't make the 2 be smaller, so I apologize, plus 6 H2Os, giving us 6 O2s, very easy to remember what this is anyways, plus C6H12O6. Okay. So this is the reaction for photosynthesis. You need to write that down. All right. So in the leaves, ground tissue is where photosynthesis happens. In the stem, ground tissue gives strength and support. And in the roots, ground tissue provides storage for food and water. Now there's different specialized types of structures that happen that can allow roots to store more or maybe not as much. But specific root vegetables that you're used to, potatoes, that's ground tissue that makes up the potato. Carrots, the carrot part that you eat. Beets, same thing. All of those expanded, lots of big ground tissue where the plant stores for itself food and water. Even in regular trees, you have ground tissue in the roots, and in the wintertime, most of the sugars are stored there. Allow for the plant to have food once spring starts, so that it can regrow its leaves, especially if it's not an evergreen tree. And then our third type of tissue is actually the last 2. Right, I said there's 4 types. The third type is vascular tissue, and there's 2 types of vascular tissue. Okay, vascular tissue is responsible for the movement of material, like water and sugar and so on, around the plant. Now there's 2 types of vascular tissue, and they are bundled together. We have xylem, which moves water and minerals from the roots up the stem to the leaves, where it's used in photosynthesis. Xylem themselves are thick-walled hollow tubes. Now what I want you to do is read page 321. Vascular tissue cells, and then on page 331 and 332, read the section about xylem and phloem. Now what I want you to also think through here is the idea that in order to make xylem, the plant uses this idea of programmed cell death. Some of the cells used to make xylem, to make these hollow tubes, they die in order for the rest of the plant to properly grow. You don't have those cells dying, the rest of the plant will not live. That's the first type is xylem. The second type is phloem. Okay, now phloem moves sugar from the leaves to other parts of the plant. And they are formed from sieve tube cells that are often connected to excuse me, to companion cells. The companion cells provide control over the sieve tube cells and over the use of phloem. Now, sometimes it's hard to remember xylem and phloem. Usually people can remember up and down. Now, if you arrange them alphabetically, P comes before X. Down and up, D comes before U. Phloem goes with down. They both come first. And I'm going to actually add to this down and around. Okay, so write those down. So phloem is sort of multi-directional. Xylem, on the other hand, is only moving up. Okay. So again, think alphabetical. Xylem and phloem, phloem and xylem. Down starts with D, and around starts with A, and then up. All right. Now, additionally, cells that are not part of the meristematic region, the growing points of the plant, they become specialized for specific function. So there's some of these specific functions you need to know about as well. Check out on page 332, there's a lovely picture of a root cell that's producing a root hair. Okay, now these are tiny projections from the cell. They increase the surface area for water absorption. There are dermal cells. They protect the cuticle. Sorry, produce the cuticle. Let's try that again. These dermal cells protect the plant. They prevent water loss. But they're special cells that produce just that cuticle. Okay. Now, some of the dermal cells on the underside of the leaf develop into guard cells. These guard cells form tiny holes in the leaf, which are called stoma, if we're talking about one of them, or stomata. Okay, there's a picture on page 321. And these stomata control gas exchange. They allow carbon dioxide into the plant, and they allow oxygen out of the plant. Okay. Finally, the other type of specialized tissue are xylem and phloem. They are not part of ground tissue. Okay, your homework. You need to read pages 320 to 324, and you need to do the questions 1 to 3, 5, and 7 on page 324. Some of them do require that you do a little bit of thinking. I'm okay with that. That's the first thing. The second thing, you need to work on making sure that you are done all of the projects that you are working on. So once you finish this homework, you've got several different assignments that you may need to make sure that they're finished and handed in. You also have to make sure that you are completing the questions assigned to you on Monday and Tuesday. Thanks.